A continent-spanning empire did not fall because 168 Spaniards were stronger than millions of Andeans. That is the children's version of the catastrophe. The deeper truth is more disturbing. On November 16th, AD 1532, at Cajamarca, Francisco Pizarro's tiny expedition did not defeat the Inca Empire in open war. It found the nerve center of a vast imperial body and seized it. The prisoner was Atahualpa, triumphant over his brother Huascar, recognized by his own victorious faction as Sapa Inca, claimant emperor of the most formidable state ever built in the Andes. Behind him stood an imperial world of staggering discipline. Roads that bound deserts, valleys, and highlands into one political organism. Storehouses prepared for armies, famine, and state redistribution. Messengers carrying commands across distances that would have broken lesser governments. Officials who could summon labor by the tens of thousands. And a sacred monarchy in which command flowed through the living body of the ruler. And yet, after the ambush at Cajamarca, that great machine hesitated. Not because the Inca were primitive. Not because horses and steel made Spanish victory inevitable. Not because a civilization of engineers, generals, priests, diplomats, and administrators suddenly forgot how power worked. The real story is darker, more strategic, and far more revealing of how states collapse. The fall of the Inca Empire was not a single battle. It was a convergence event. Smallpox had already crossed political frontiers like an invisible assassin, striking at bodies, succession, confidence, and sacred legitimacy. Civil war had torn the imperial elite into rival factions. Provincial resentments smoldered beneath the surface of imperial order, especially among peoples recently absorbed into Cuzco's authority. Spanish intelligence was incomplete, often crude, and filtered through interpreters and ambition, but it was opportunistic enough to recognize fracture. And at the center of the crisis stood a political design of terrible brilliance: absolute centralization. Tawantinsuyu could move with astonishing speed when the emperor commanded. Labor moved, armies moved, food moved, messages moved. Local elites obeyed because obedience was not merely administrative. It was ritual, political, and cosmic. But the same design carried a hidden danger. A system built around sacred command could become vulnerable when that command was trapped inside a hostage room. This is Professor Adrian Lockwell for Archives of Humanity. This investigation will not treat Cajamarca as a simple clash of old world and new, nor as a crude myth of European triumph over indigenous weakness. It must be examined from the war room, the Senate floor, and the grand chessboard of time, because Cajamarca was not merely a battle. It was a test of an imperial operating system under maximum stress. Here is the paradox at the heart of the matter. Pizarro's men could not conquer Tawantinsuyu by ordinary force in AD 1532. They could not outnumber it. They could not outproduce it. They could not out-administer it. They could not hold the Andes by themselves. But they could do something more precise. They could capture the human switch through which legitimacy, fear, ritual, and obedience were routed. A sacred monarchy can generate magnificent unity. It can make roads function like arteries, labor appear as duty, conquest feel like cosmic order, and distant provinces answer a command from the imperial center. But it can also create a single point of failure. When the ruler is not merely a ruler, but the axis between earth, empire, and divine authority, then hostage politics becomes a weapon of almost apocalyptic force. Capture the emperor, and the machinery of obedience did not vanish. It waited for orders. That is why Cajamarca matters. Not because one afternoon explains everything, but because one afternoon revealed everything. The hidden fragility inside a state that appeared invincible from the outside. To understand why the capture of one man could paralyze an empire, the structure behind that man must first be opened. That structure was Tawantinsuyu, the empire of the four quarters centered on Cuzco, stretched across the Andes, and built as one of history's most astonishing architectures of command. The answer begins inside the machinery of Andean power. Atahualpa mattered so profoundly because he stood at the center of a system designed to convert sacred authority into movement. Armies moving, labor moving, food moving, orders moving, fear moving. The Inca called that system Tawantinsuyu, the four parts together. Its ritual and political heart was Cuzco, the imperial center from which authority radiated across much of the Andean world by the early 16th century AD. This was not a single people ruling a quiet homeland. It was a vast, multi-ethnic empire binding together coastal valleys, highland communities, conquered kingdoms, local cults, rival languages, and populations with memories older than Inca rule itself. And that detail is decisive. Tawantinsuyu was enormous, but historically young. Its great expansion accelerated in the 15th century under Pachacuti, the ruler traditionally credited with transforming Cuzco from a regional power into an imperial engine. Topa Inca Yupanqui and Huayna Capac then pushed that engine farther, extending Inca influence across distances that would have broken less disciplined states. In only a few generations, the Inca built one of the most formidable empires on Earth. But speed leaves seams. Rapid conquest can build roads faster than loyalty, impose tribute faster than identity, and demand obedience before belonging. The genius of the Inca state was logistics. Roads tied the empire together like imperial arteries. Relay runners, the chasquis, carried messages with disciplined speed. Quipu specialists recorded accounts, obligations, populations, and stores through knotted cords. Not alphabetic writing in the European sense, but a sophisticated administrative technology that Spanish observers often fail to understand. Storehouses, the culcas, held maize, cloth, weapons, and preserved foods against famine, war, and royal command. The MITA labor system mobilized communities for agriculture, construction, mining, road maintenance, and military service. Mitmakuna resettled populations could be moved to secure rebellious zones, spread loyal groups, or reorganize production. Local leaders, the Caracas, became indispensable brokers between Cuzco's demands and village life. This was not a modern nation-state. It did not rule through citizenship, printed statutes, or parchment bureaucracy. It ruled through negotiated hierarchy. Tribute labor, public works, sacred reciprocity, ritual legitimacy, elite marriage, intimidation, redistribution, and the careful management of local power. The empire did not simply crush every community beneath it. It bargained, absorbed, threatened, rewarded, relocated, and remembered. The strength was extraordinary. Orders could cross extreme geography. Armies could be supplied. Communities could be counted, taxed in labor, relocated, honored, punished, and folded into the imperial structure. Tontinsuyu made mountains administratively usable. It turned landscape into command. But the same roads that unified the empire could later help outsiders move through it. The same culcas that sustained Inca armies could provision new masters. The same Caracas who served Cuzco could calculate, under pressure, that Spanish disruption might weaken an older imperial burden. Infrastructure is never politically neutral. It serves whoever controls the command. At the center stood the Sapa Inca. He was not merely an executive ruler issuing policy. He was the cosmic political axis, the living source of legitimacy, the figure through whom hierarchy became sacred. The empire's administrative coherence depended on recognition of his authority. If that recognition fractured, the roads, stores, labor drafts, and provincial elites did not disappear. They waited to learn whose command had become real. Even royal death deepened the tension. Through the practice often called split inheritance, deceased rulers retained estates, servants, cults, and influence through their royal lineages, while each living ruler needed to build his own wealth, prestige, and political base. Expansion was therefore not just ambition. It was built into the structure of dynastic power. Every emperor needed glory. Every royal lineage guarded memory and property. Beneath the grandeur, competition accumulated. So Tontinsuyu was mighty and precarious at once. Centralized enough to mobilize millions, young enough to be resented, sacred enough to inspire obedience, and personal enough to become vulnerable if the sacred body at the center vanished. And before Francisco Pizarro reached that center, another force had already entered the imperial bloodstream. Invisible, borderless, and politically devastating epidemic disease. The Andes were not the only chessboard in motion. While Tontinsuyu refined its roads, storehouses, labor drafts, sacred hierarchy, and command networks, another imperial machine was gathering force across the ocean. Less orderly, less rooted in ancient Andean legitimacy, but ravenous, legally armed, and already trained in the violence of the Caribbean and Mexico. By AD 1532, Spain did not enter Peru as a bewildered outsider encountering empire for the first time. It arrived with memory. It arrived with precedent. 11 years earlier, in AD 1521, Tenochtitlan, the magnificent Mexica capital, had fallen after a brutal convergence of siege warfare, epidemic disease, Spanish aggression, factional rebellion, and, decisively, indigenous alliances. Hernán Cortés had not conquered central Mexico alone. He survived because he learned a terrible method of conquest. Enter an imperial world surrounded by resentments, identify those who have reason to hate the center, ally with them, isolate the ruler, seize the symbols of command, and wrap the entire operation in the language of Christian monarchy and royal law. This method of conquest was not a polished doctrine preserved in a military manual. It was more dangerous than that. It was a repertoire of habits forged by desperate men in unstable frontiers. Legalistic demands, sudden violence, hostage politics, cavalry shock, steel weapons, and firearms used less as engines of mass killing than as instruments of terror, noise, smoke, and psychological rupture. But the deepest weapon was political. Spain's frontier warbands learned that empires are rarely defeated only from outside. They are entered through the doors opened by internal enemies. Francisco Pizarro operated in the shadow of Cortés. New Spain was not merely a conquered territory. It was a precedent, a rumor, a temptation. It had proved that men of obscure birth could become governors, lords, millionaires, and founders of dynasties if they risked enough, killed enough, and persuaded the crown afterward that God and the king had been served. Pizarro's voyages along the Pacific coast in the AD 1520s were therefore not random wandering. They were reconnaissance for opportunity. Reports filtered northward of a wealthy empire beyond the equator, a realm of temples, textiles, metals, disciplined armies, and rulers who commanded riches on a scale that made Caribbean plunder look provincial. The enterprise was not the march of a modern national army. It was closer to a high-risk venture capitalist warband, privately financed and politically explosive. Pizarro, Diego de Almagro, and the priest Hernando de Luque formed a partnership of ambition, debt, calculation, and mutual suspicion. Later, Pizarro's brothers would deepen the family grip on the venture. These men were not merely soldiers. They were armed entrepreneurs gambling credit, reputation, body, and soul on the possibility of converting violence into title. Failure meant disgrace, ruin, or death. Success meant governorships, estates, coats of arms, and a place inside the formal hierarchy of empire. And the Spanish crown, distant but never absent, supplied the architecture of legitimacy. The Capitulation de Toledo in AD 1529 granted Pizarro authority over conquest claims in the south, giving private ambition a royal seal. This was one of the great paradoxes of the Spanish imperial frontier. Law did not restrain predation, it often organized it. Rituals such as the requerimiento exposed the psychology of the project with chilling clarity. A legal theological script asserted Spanish and Christian authority, even when indigenous audiences could not meaningfully understand the demand, much less consent to it. Law became theater. Theater became permission. Permission became conquest. Here, scale deceives the eye. Tawantinsuyu was vast, populous, and administered across mountains, deserts, valleys, and coastlands. Pizarro's expedition was tiny, fragile, and always one disaster away from extinction. Yet history is not decided by size alone. Small actors become decisive when they carry a tested method of conquest into a system whose tensions they do not need to create, only recognize and exploit. Before Cajamarca, then, two imperial logics were already advancing toward collision. One, an Andean operating system built on sacred command, labor obligation, and administrative brilliance. The other, an Atlantic engine of debt, law, opportunism, violence, and royal ambition. But even this human machinery was not the first force to strike the Inca center. Ahead of Pizarro moved an unseen strategist, crossing frontiers faster than armies, entering royal courts without negotiation, and opening the most dangerous question any sacred monarchy can face. Who commands when the sacred body dies? The Spanish method mattered, but the first conqueror to reach the Andes was not a horseman. It was a pathogen moving through human connection. Exchange, kinship, travel, diplomacy, captivity, grief, and rumor. Smallpox, or an epidemic closely resembling it, likely spread into the Andean world before Pizarro ever stood before the imperial core, transmitted through indigenous networks after European contact had already ruptured other parts of the Americas. This point requires caution. The sources are fragmentary. The diagnosis remains debated. The precise chronology cannot be nailed down with the confidence of a royal decree carved in stone. Yet the strategic pattern is difficult to ignore. Around AD 1527, Huayna Capac, the Sapa Inca who had carried imperial expansion deep into the north, likely died during a devastating epidemic often identified as smallpox. His probable heir, Huayna Capac, may have died in the same crisis or in its immediate shadow. The empire did not merely lose a ruler. It may have lost the bridge between one reign and the next. That distinction is everything. Epidemic disease was not background noise in the fall of Tawantinsuyu. It was a constitutional shock. It struck not only bodies, but offices, loyalties, ceremonies, chains of command, and the political imagination of an empire built around sacred kingship. Huayna Capac was not simply an administrator whose replacement could be appointed through an impersonal legal mechanism. He was the living axis of imperial legitimacy, the sacred political center through whom order was recognized and obedience became meaningful. When such a figure dies suddenly, death becomes more than tragedy. It becomes evidence. Evidence for rival lineages. Evidence for anxious nobles. Evidence for priests trying to explain cosmic disorder. Evidence for conquered provinces quietly asking whether Cuzco's power still carried the protection it claimed. A plague does not merely kill people. It kills assumptions. It can remove priests who interpret crisis, administrators who coordinate grain and labor, soldiers who enforce commands, couriers who carry orders, nobles who mediate loyalty, and heirs whose existence prevents ambition from becoming open conflict. It can make obedience feel less certain at the exact moment when certainty is the state's most precious resource. In an empire as centralized as Tontinsuyu, legitimacy was not decorative. It was infrastructure, and this empire, for all its brilliance, was young. Pachacuti, Topa Inca Yupanqui, and Huayna Capac had forged vast dominion in only a few generations. Rapid expansion created roads, storehouses, tribute labor, military reach, and administrative power. But speed also left seams. Newly conquered peoples remembered the violence of incorporation. Local Caracas calculated advantage and survival. Royal Panicas guarded ancestral prestige. Cuzco's dynastic elites watched the northern armies with suspicion. Northern commanders, shaped by Huayna Capac's campaigns and distant from Cuzco's court, possessed their own military confidence and political networks. Then disease struck the throne. No responsible account should pretend that exact population losses in this first phase can be stated with numerical certainty. The demographic catastrophe of the Andes unfolded over decades, through repeated epidemics, warfare, displacement, forced labor, hunger, and colonial disruption. But even before that longer collapse reached its full force, epidemic disease had already performed a strategic decapitation. It damaged state capacity. It unsettled ritual confidence. It transformed succession from a managed elite process into a contest over meaning, inheritance, and command. Smallpox did not need to defeat the Inca army. It only needed to open the throne. And once the throne was open, Tontinsuyu faced the question every sacred monarchy fears more than invasion. When the center disappears, who has the right to command the world it held together? The vacant throne did not simply invite a successor. It invited a constitutional crisis fought with armies. After Huayna Capac's death, Tontinsuyu faced the question every sacred monarchy fears most. Not merely who was strong enough to rule, but who could make power appear legitimate. Inca succession was not automatic primogeniture. No single ladder carried the eldest son peacefully to the summit. Legitimacy had to be constructed from royal blood, elite consent, ritual recognition, military reputation, priestly support, noble calculation, and control over the practical arteries of empire. Roads, storehouses, soldiers, messengers, and fear. Huascar stood closest to Cuzco, the dynastic furnace of the empire. There, royal panicas, ancestral cults, and old noble houses guarded the sacred grammar of rule. His claim drew force from the imperial center, from memory, from ceremony, and from the political weight of the old capital. Atahualpa, by contrast, was tied to the northern sphere around Quito and to the hardened armies that had campaigned under Huayna Capac. Yet this was not a clean north against south conflict in the modern nationalist sense. That language belongs to later centuries. This was more dangerous, a struggle inside the imperial elite over who owned legitimacy itself. Huascar's strength was also his trap. Cuzco gave him ritual gravity, but it surrounded him with rival lineages whose loyalty was conditional, jealous, and deeply political. He appears to have distrusted powerful panicas and potential claimants who could turn sacred ancestry into opposition. In the Inca world, dead rulers still possessed estates, attendance, and cultic significance. Even the past could become a political faction. Huascar was not simply defending a throne. He was trying to master an aristocracy crowded with memories, debts, privileges, and ambitions. Atahualpa's advantage lay elsewhere. He did not merely possess a claim. He possessed commanders. Calcocamac, Quizquiz, and Rumiñahui were not ceremonial figures around a prince. They were experienced generals, veterans of expansion, discipline, intimidation, and operational movement across the Andean world. Their support gave Atahualpa what ritual language alone could not provide: organized force. The civil war tore through the upper machinery of Tontinsuyu. Armies moved, loyalties shifted. Cuzco's prestige collided with the northern military apparatus. Huascar was defeated and captured before, or around the same broad moment as Pizarro's entry into the highlands. The sources are difficult, shaped by Spanish chroniclers and later Andean memory, but the strategic meaning is unmistakable. By Cajamarca in AD 1532, Atahualpa had effectively won the internal war, and civil war victory is never clean. It leaves behind frightened nobles, ruined factions, hidden enemies, and survivors waiting to discover whether obedience will save them. Atahualpa's faction carried out brutal reprisals against Cuzco lineages and potential claimants. Strategically, the logic was recognizable. Remove alternative centers before they become banners. But each purge that destroyed a rival also manufactured new hatred. Each noble who bowed did not necessarily become loyal. Rulers often mistake silence for allegiance when terror has done the work of persuasion. This is the hidden main event before Cajamarca. The Inca Empire did not meet Spain as a unified colossus with one mind and one will. It met Spain as a victorious faction standing amid the wreckage of its own political class. Armies were strained. Elites were intimidated or broken. Legitimacy was contested. The sacred center had been wounded by disease, then ambition, then revenge. Atahualpa, therefore, was not foolish when he assessed the small Spanish expedition. He was a triumphant political actor operating with incomplete information. He had defeated the greatest internal rival to his command. From that height, a small band of bearded foreigners with horses, metal weapons, loud devices, and strange rituals could appear dangerous, useful, insulting, even disposable, but still manageable inside the logic of imperial hierarchy. That was the psychological aftertaste of victory. Civil war narrows the imagination. It teaches leaders that the next threat will resemble the last enemy conquered. But Pizarro was not Huascar. The Spaniards did not need to win the succession struggle. They needed to seize the man who had just won it. So Tawantinsuyu entered its most perilous hour divided, exhausted, and over-centralized around a triumphant claimant whose authority was immense, but newly isolated. Victory had made Atahualpa powerful, but it had also made him alone. Into this fractured imperial landscape stepped Francisco Pizarro, not as the commander of a conquering army, but as the leader of a wager so extreme that its logic belonged less to conventional warfare than to political surgery. By the time the Spaniards reached Cajamarca in November of AD 1532, their force is commonly placed at around 168 men, though the exact count varies in the sources. They carried horses, steel swords, lances, crossbows, arquebus, and small artillery pieces described in some accounts as falconets or cannon-like weapons. They also carried armor, interpreters, experience from earlier expeditions, and an almost volcanic hunger for wealth, status, and royal favor. But against Tawantinsuyu, this was not an army in any normal imperial sense. It was a dagger moving toward the nervous system of a giant. Pizarro understood the central impossibility. He could not conquer the Inca Empire by attrition. He could not defeat every provincial army, occupy every valley, cut every road, feed his men indefinitely in the highlands, or survive a fully coordinated imperial response. Numbers opposed him, distance opposed him, geography opposed him, time opposed him. His only path was asymmetry. Surprise, shock, hostage capture, alliance building, and the manipulation of legitimacy. This made the expedition an intelligence war before it became a military one. Spanish knowledge had accumulated slowly through reconnaissance along the Pacific coast in the AD 1520s, coastal encounters, indigenous informants, interpreters such as Felipillo, whose role remains essential but contested, and the close reading of Andean political behavior. Every rumor mattered. Roads meant mobility. Storehouses meant supply. Noble rivalries meant fracture. Civil war meant opportunity. Ceremony meant hierarchy. Hierarchy meant leverage. Then came the decisive information. Tawantinsuyu had been torn by the struggle between Huascar and Atahualpa. A united empire would have been close to impossible for Pizarro to defeat directly. But a divided empire offered something more valuable than weakness. It offered uncertainty. Its elites were wounded. Its loyalties had been tested by blood. Its obedience still existed, but its moral center had been shaken. Pizarro also operated beneath the shadow of another conquest. From AD 1519 to AD 1521, Hernán Cortés had entered the world of the Mexica, seized Moctezuma, exploited enemies of Tenochtitlan, and transformed imperial politics into a weapon. The Andes were not Mexico. Inca rule and Mexica power differed profoundly in geography, administration, tribute, and sacred authority. But one strategic lesson crossed the Spanish imagination like a spark through dry grass. Seize the ruler, and a tiny force might suddenly speak with the weight of an empire. This was the dark genius of hostage politics. Pizarro did not need to defeat the empire first. He needed the empire to obey the wrong center of command. Conquistador violence operated within this psychological economy. A few men could not kill millions, but spectacular brutality could dominate perception, rupture command, and create the illusion of inevitability. Horses were not unstoppable machines. Steel was not destiny. Arquebus were slow, inaccurate, and often more terrifying than efficient. Yet when combined with surprise, speed, noise, and concentrated aggression, they could turn the first moments of contact into political paralysis. And still, the gamble was terrifying. Pizarro's men were isolated deep inside a world they did not control, dependent on uncertain translations, surrounded by imperial power, and far from rescue. Their boldness was partly strategic brilliance and partly the logic of men with no safe retreat. Cajamarca, then, was not a battlefield in the ordinary sense. It was shaped into a trap because a normal battle would have destroyed the Spaniards. Pizarro needed one exposed command center, one living captive, one political nerve around which the machinery of obedience still revolved. The next question belongs to Atahualpa's side of the chessboard. If Pizarro needed the emperor as a hostage, why did Atahualpa allow the meeting to occur at all? Atahualpa's side of the board demands the same cold seriousness granted to Pizarro's. He was not a fool drifting blindly into disaster, and he was not simply a ruler who mistook strangers for gods. That explanation is too convenient, too flattering to the victors, and too small for the scale of what happened. Atahualpa arrived near Cajamarca as the recent winner of a brutal imperial civil war. Huascar had been defeated. The northern armies that had carried Atahualpa to power remained formidable. Veteran commanders still operated across a fractured but functioning imperial landscape. Exact numbers are debated, as they often are in conquest chronicles, but the strategic reality is unmistakable. The Spaniards were the tiny party. Atahualpa stood near the center of Andean power, and that power shaped what he believed was possible. To Atahualpa, the newcomers were alarming, but not necessarily existential. They were few, they were foreign, they possessed animals unknown in the Andes, weapons that produced terrifying noise, blades of unusual force, and rituals whose political meaning remained opaque. Reports of Spanish violence had reached him from the coast and along the road. He knew they could kill. He knew they could disrupt. But knowing that an intruder is dangerous is not the same as knowing what category of danger it represents. This was the intelligence problem at the heart of Cajamarca. The Inca could observe Spanish behavior, but they did not yet possess the historical pattern behind it. Conquest practices refined in the Caribbean and Mexico, the seizure of rulers, the manipulation of local factions, the use of interpreters, the performance of legality before violence, and the conversion of sacred authority into hostage politics. Atahualpa had information, but not the model. And in history, information without the correct model can become a beautifully organized road into catastrophe. Recent victory made the misclassification even more likely. Rulers who have just defeated their greatest internal enemy often become prisoners of their own success. Atahualpa had survived the constitutional storm opened by Huayna Capac's death. He had outmaneuvered Huascar, broken hostile lineages, and watched imperial elites bend before his command. From that height, a band of fewer than 200 foreigners could be interpreted as a manageable anomaly. Perhaps useful as curiosities, perhaps exploitable as allies, perhaps punishable as trespassers, but not yet the spear point of a continental rupture. Here the psychological trap becomes visible. Power does not merely give rulers options, it gives them categories. The empire taught Atahualpa that hierarchy ordered danger. A provincial lord, a rebellious lineage, a captive rival, a ritual embassy, each had a place inside the imperial grammar. Status could command space. Ceremony could domesticate threat. The presence of the Sapa Inca was itself a political instrument. So the meeting at Cajamarca on November 16, AD 1532, was not merely a military appointment. It was theater against theater. Atahualpa's entrance with attendance and ceremonial confidence expressed the logic of imperial hierarchy. He was not approaching Pizarro as an equal negotiator seeking terms. He was granting an audience, displaying supremacy, and measuring these foreigners within the symbolic order he understood. The absence of an immediate massed Inca attack has often been mistaken for stupidity before the fact. But restraint can be calculation, can be confidence in overwhelming nearby force, can be protocol, can be uncertainty. It can be the decision of a victorious ruler who believes time is on his side, and that a small, dangerous anomaly can still be contained without unleashing disorder. The Spaniards read that ceremonial distance differently. To them, it was not proof of safety. It was an opening. Friar Vicente de Valverde stood at the edge of this collision, associated in the chronicles with demands for Christian and royal submission, part of the wider tradition of the requerimiento, the legal fiction by which conquest dressed coercion in the language of consent. The famous episode of the book or breviary, rejected or mishandled by Atahualpa, comes through Spanish accounts shaped by the need to justify what followed. It must be treated cautiously, but the deeper mechanism is clear. Misunderstanding was transformed into authorization. Atahualpa treated Pizarro as a problem within the empire's symbolic order. Pizarro treated Atahualpa as the switch that controlled the order. That was the fatal misclassification. Atahualpa did not lack power. He lacked a category for the kind of power standing in front of him. And once that category failed, Cajamarca became the place where legal theater, religious insult, military ambush, and imperial confidence converged in a single afternoon. On November 16, AD 1532, at Cajamarca, the fatal misclassification became in operation. Francisco Pizarro did not enter the Highland Plaza as a commander seeking a balanced contest between armies. He entered as a political gambler aiming a small expedition at the exposed nerve of an empire. His force, commonly given as fewer than 200 Spaniards, carried cavalry, infantry, steel swords, lances, crossbows, arquebus, and small artillery. Against Tawantinsuyu, this was not conquest by mass. It was conquest by leverage. The deployment reveals the mind behind the trap. Spanish cavalry and foot soldiers were concealed in structures around the plaza, positioned to burst out from several directions when the signal came. Pizarro understood the arithmetic of survival. In a conventional battle against the manpower available to the Inca world, his men could be encircled, exhausted, and erased. So he chose the opposite of conventional war: compression, surprise, shock, and seizure. The objective was brutally narrow. Atahualpa had to be captured alive. Atahualpa entered with ceremonial confidence, not with the posture of a ruler expecting immediate annihilation. His forces were nearby, and his recent victory over Huascar had placed him at the summit of imperial power. He came as the Sapa Inca, surrounded by attendants and nobles, operating inside a political universe where hierarchy itself could discipline danger. In that universe, the ruler's presence ordered reality. But the Spaniards were not seeking a place within his hierarchy. They were preparing to invert it. Then came the delegation. Friar Vicente de Valverde approached with the language of Christian monarchy, Spanish sovereignty, and submission. The famous episode of the book or breviary, the demand, the translation, the rejection or dropping of the object, has survived through Spanish chroniclers such as Francisco de Xerez, Pedro Pizarro, and later writers. Yet this scene cannot be treated as a transparent transcript of truth. It was shaped by conquest, memory, religious justification, and the legal theater Spain used to make violence appear lawful. The exchange mattered not only for what may have been said. It mattered because it created the ritual permission for the attack. The signal followed. The trap opened. Horses surged into the plaza. Trumpets, firearms, steel, and lances multiplied panic. The attack struck not a prepared Inca battle line, but an imperial entourage caught inside a ceremonial frame. The shock was psychological as much as physical. Horses were not magic. Firearms were not destiny. Inca warriors were not inherently ineffective. But surprise, enclosed space, unfamiliar tactics, and the sudden collapse of protocol created strategic vertigo at the exact point where command needed clarity. Reported casualty numbers come largely through Spanish accounts, and those figures must be handled cautiously. Chroniclers had strong incentives to magnify divine favor, Spanish courage, and Inca helplessness. The central fact, however, does not depend on inflated numbers. Atahualpa was seized. Pizarro himself helped secure him, because the expedition's future depended on preventing the emperor's death amid the chaos. Here Cajamarca reveals its true nature. It was not primarily a battle won by superior weapons. It was a hostage operation executed under diplomatic cover and sanctified by legal religious theater. The Spaniards did not need to destroy the Inca state in the plaza. They needed to seize the human being through whom the state recognized command. The plaza was not the conquest. The prisoner was. Once Atahualpa was in Spanish hands, Spanish weakness changed form. The expedition remained isolated, fragile, and surrounded by a world it did not control. Yet it now possessed the sacred political center of that world. The Inca response was constrained by the logic of its own authority. If the Sapa Inca lived, his orders still carried weight. If his life was threatened, attack became politically dangerous. If factions were still bleeding from civil war, coordinated action became harder. If Atahualpa commanded restraint, obedience itself could become paralysis. That is why the question of why Inca forces did not simply annihilate the Spaniards afterward has no single answer. The hostage mattered. Command uncertainty mattered. Elite shock mattered. The war between Huascar and Atahualpa mattered. So did factional calculation, fear for the emperor, and the terrifying novelty of an enemy willing to make the ruler's body into the battlefield. In one afternoon, the symbolic hierarchy of the Andes was turned inside out. The emperor who expected deference became the captive through whom strangers would begin issuing history's most expensive commands. And after Cajamarca, the story became even stranger. Chained authority still worked, and the captors learned that an empire could be made to pay ransom to the men who had seized its voice. The astonishing fact after Cajamarca is not that Atahualpa promised treasure. It is that the promise could still mobilize an empire. From captivity in Cajamarca, the Sapa Inca offered to fill a room once with gold objects and twice with silver as the price of his release. Spanish chroniclers later measured the space, counted the loads, and lingered over vessels, plaques, ornaments, and sacred objects stripped from temples and palaces across the Andes. But the deeper meaning was not luxury. It was obedience. The ransom room was a political X-ray of Tawantinsuyu. After the ambush, after the massacre in the plaza, after fewer than 200 foreigners had seized the emperor himself, the imperial operating system still responded. Messengers still traveled. Local authorities still calculated where legitimacy seemed to reside. Storehouses and sacred centers yielded wealth. Commands moved through the mountains because the captive ruler's voice had not lost its force. Gold made the Spaniards rich. Atahualpa's obedience made them dangerous. For Pizarro's men, that success created a paradox sharper than victory. The prisoner was their greatest asset and their greatest terror. Alive, Atahualpa could summon wealth, restrain retaliation, negotiate compliance, and keep the Spanish position from collapsing under its own absurdity. But alive, he also remained the gravitational center of a continent-sized state. Every caravan entering Cajamarca proved the same frightening fact. The man in chains was not powerless. He was empire compressed into a body. Then came the matter of Huascar. During Atahualpa's captivity, Huascar, the defeated rival claimant tied to the dynastic world of Cuzco, was killed. Many Spanish accounts attribute his death to Atahualpa's orders or to forces acting for his faction, though the motives and mechanics are filtered through hostile and self-justifying chronicles. Certainty is difficult. The strategic consequence is not. Huascar had been an alternative center of legitimacy. He might have become a Spanish instrument, a counter-emperor, a way to turn the Inca civil war against Atahualpa himself. His death narrowed Spanish options and deepened Spanish suspicion. To the captors, Atahualpa no longer appeared only as a ransom machine. He appeared as a ruler still moving pieces from inside the cage. Rumors multiplied. Inca armies were said to be gathering. Generals such as Cuzco and Calcucamac remained forces in a fractured but still lethal military landscape. Spanish fear here must not be mistaken for innocence. It was strategic panic. These men were isolated in the highlands, vastly outnumbered, and now burdened with treasure that made them vulnerable to Andean resistance and Spanish rivalry alike. They wanted to move toward Cuzco, but feared marching with Atahualpa. They feared leaving him behind. They feared releasing him most of all. So law entered the room, as it often does in conquest, after violence had already chosen its direction. In AD 1533, Atahualpa was tried under Spanish authority. The charges preserved in chronicled accounts included idolatry, rebellion, conspiracy, polygamy, fratricide, and responsibility for Huascar's death. This was not neutral justice. It was legal theater performed by armed men who needed a political danger transformed into a moral verdict. Francisco de Xerez, Pedro Pizarro, and later narrators remain essential sources, but they must be read with caution. Their pages record events while also defending the conquest that produced them. In many accounts, Atahualpa accepted baptism before execution and received a Christian name. His sentence was then changed from burning to strangulation. To Spanish religious imagination, the detail mattered. It allowed domination to be narrated as punishment, conversion, judgment, and necessity all at once. Strategically, the execution solved an immediate problem. It removed the living center whose authority the Spaniards had exploited but could not safely command. Yet it also shattered the legitimacy they had borrowed. The captive emperor had made hostage governance possible because the empire still recognized his voice. Once that voice was silenced, the Spaniards inherited not a stable kingdom, but a vacuum filled with succession claims, revenge, factional calculation, and fear. Atahualpa's death was therefore both solution and escalation. It ended the politics of the emperor in chains, but it did not end the empire's crisis. With Atahualpa gone, the Spaniards needed a new face for power. They would not abolish the Inca system immediately. They would clothe their advance in Inca names and ride the captured grammar of empire toward Cuzco. The death of Atahualpa did not hand the Spaniards a functioning state. It handed them a more delicate problem. An empire trained to obey sacred kingship, now forced to watch foreigners destroy one claimant and manufacture another. Pizarro understood the danger immediately. A few dozen Spaniards could not administer Tontinsuyu by decree. They could not speak its political languages well enough, could not command its roads directly, could not force every curaca, porter, priest, and provincial lord into obedience by Spanish power alone. So they did what successful occupiers often do in the first stage of conquest. They borrowed the costume of legitimacy from the system they had just wounded. After Atahualpa's execution in AD 1533, the Spaniards elevated Tupac Hualpa, also known in some sources as Toparpa, a son of Huayna Capac, as a Spanish-backed Inca ruler. The calculation was brutally practical. A royal name could quiet hesitation. A royal name could help open storehouses, summon labor, secure passage, and persuade uncertain elites that the empire had not ended, but merely changed its direction of command. Continuity, in other words, became a weapon. But puppet legitimacy is a fragile alloy. Atahualpa died soon afterward during the movement toward Cuzco, likely from illness, though suspicion and rumor naturally surrounded any royal death in such a poisoned political atmosphere. His death forced another improvisation. The Spaniards would soon turn toward Manco Inca, another son of Huayna Capac, whose cooperation appeared to offer the perfect colonial formula. An Inca face placed before Spanish authority. The march to Cuzco in AD 1533 was therefore not a simple military advance. It was a moving political bargain through a shattered imperial world. Spanish cavalry and infantry mattered, but they were only one element in a far larger coalition. Around them gathered indigenous allies, Cuzco factions hostile to Atahualpa's northern power base, local leaders seeking advantage, communities seeking protection, and elites calculating how to survive the collapse of the old center. This is where the simple story breaks apart. The Andes did not act with one mind. Some Andean groups saw the Spaniards as terrifying intruders. Others saw them, at least temporarily, as instruments against Atahualpa's faction. Some remembered Inca domination with bitterness. Others had served the imperial order and feared what would replace it. These choices were not passive submission. They were strategic wagers made under extreme uncertainty, by people trapped between old imperial obligations and a new violence no one yet fully understood. Against this advancing coalition stood the remnants of Atahualpa's military machine. His generals, especially Vilcabamba and Cuzco, remained dangerous because they possessed more than soldiers. They possessed knowledge of how the empire moved. They understood routes, loyalties, supply, intimidation, and the psychology of command. Vilcabamba, already in Spanish hands, represented a living threat precisely because he could still help animate resistance. Cuzco continued the struggle, but the civil war had drained the empire of trust at the very moment unity became a matter of survival. When Cuzco was occupied in AD 1533, the Spaniards seized far more than a capital. They entered the symbolic and administrative heart of Tawantinsuyu. Cuzco was not merely where rulers had lived. It was where hierarchy became sacred, where roads radiated outward, where obligations were organized, where conquered peoples were placed into an imperial story larger than themselves. Here lay the deepest irony of the conquest. The Inca system had been built for integration. Roads to carry orders, culcas to feed armies, MITA obligations to mobilize labor, Caracas to mediate obedience, and royal authority to bind the machinery together. Once the Spaniards controlled key nodes, royal names, interpreters, elite alliances, routes, and the capital itself, that same integration lowered the cost of domination. The conqueror did not need to invent a new machine overnight. He could seize the levers of the old one. The Spaniards did not yet possess the Andes, but they had entered the command grammar of the Andes, and that grammar would soon produce its own rebellion. Manco Inca, raised by the Spaniards as a useful sovereign, would discover that a crown under foreign control is not kingship. It is a cage. Yet the occupation of Cuzco was not the same as possession of the Andes. Spain had entered the imperial capital, seized the symbols of rule, and learned to speak through Inca authority. But symbols are unstable weapons. The same royal name that helped conquest move through the old imperial channels could also become the banner under which the old order tried to return. Manco Inca began as a Spanish-backed sovereign, elevated after the deaths of Atahualpa and Atahualpa because he appeared useful to the new masters of Cuzco. To the Spaniards, he was legitimacy in Andean form, a living seal through which tribute, labor, and obedience might continue to flow. To many Andeans, however, he was not merely a convenience. He was a surviving thread of sacred kingship, a possible bridge back to a world that had been violently interrupted. But collaboration under conquest is rarely stable. It is built from fear, calculation, insult, and waiting. Manco's cooperation deteriorated under Spanish constraint, exploitation, and humiliation. The Pizarro faction in Cuzco did not treat him as a partner in a new political order. They treated him as an instrument. He was expected to wear the mask of sovereignty while others controlled the command beneath it. That contradiction became explosive. A ruler can be used as a puppet only so long before the puppet remembers he is also a king. In AD 1536, Manco Inca struck. The revolt was not the final twitch of a dead empire. It was a coordinated counteroffensive against a conquest still dangerously incomplete. Across the highlands, forces mobilized. Cuzco came under siege. Sacsayhuaman, the great fortress above the city, became a decisive battlefield in the struggle for the imperial heart. Spanish survival narrowed to a brutal strategic equation. A small occupying force trapped deep in hostile terrain, relying on cavalry, fortifications, discipline, and indigenous allies whose motives were rooted in local rivalries, survival politics, and old grievances against Cuzco's domination. This is where the simple story of sudden conquest collapses. Cajamarca broke the center, but not the will to restore it. Manco's revolt nearly succeeded because it understood the terrain, the roads, the mechanisms of mobilization, and the fragility of an enemy stretched across a vast political landscape. The Spaniards were not omnipotent. They were vulnerable, outnumbered, and often one failed maneuver away from disaster. Horses and steel mattered, but so did timing, intelligence, morale, and the psychological force of an empire refusing to accept its own obituary. And yet the revolt did not expel the Spaniards permanently. Not because resistance lacked courage, and not because Spanish victory had been inevitable, but because uprisings are not won by numbers alone. Siege warfare punishes armies that must sustain pressure over time. Cavalry could still shatter formations in open tactical moments. Fortified positions bought the invaders time. Indigenous allies prevented the conflict from becoming a single united Andean war against Spain. Factional divisions, leadership constraints, and the difficulty of coordinating rebellion across mountain regions all shaped the outcome. Manco withdrew, but withdrawal was not disappearance. He retreated into Vilcabamba, where an independent Neo-Inca state survived for decades. From that refuge, Inca authority adapted. It negotiated, raided, endured, and remembered. Vilcabamba was more than a hiding place. It was a counterclaim to history, a royal ember kept alive beyond the first reach of Spanish consolidation. Only in AD 1572 did Spain move decisively against Vilcabamba. Tupac Amaru, the last ruler of that independent Inca line, was captured and executed. This was not the later 18th century rebel who would inherit the name as a symbol of resistance, but the 16th century sovereign whose death marked the staged end of independent Inca kingship. Even then, the Andean world did not vanish. One form of sovereignty had been defeated. A civilization had not been erased. Conquest was a process, not a single day. Cajamarca was decisive, but not final. And as armed resistance was contained, a deeper transformation was already underway. Population, labor, faith, land, and memory were being reorganized into a colonial order whose consequences would reach far beyond the fall of any one dynasty. Vilcabamba preserved a royal alternative, but beyond its mountain refuge, a quieter conquest was already hardening into institutions. It advanced through ledgers, lawsuits, baptismal fonts, tribute lists, and labor drafts. The sword had broken the imperial center. Paperwork began to reorganize the world around it. In the first years after the occupation of Cuzco, Spanish rule was not a calm architecture of empire. It was a scramble for reward. The men who had followed Pizarro expected wealth, rank, tribute, labor, and recognition from the crown. The central instrument became the encomienda. In theory, not ownership of land or people, but a grant allowing a Spaniard to receive tribute and labor from indigenous communities while claiming a duty to protect and Christianize them. In practice, protection often became extraction wearing the costume of law. This was one of conquest's darkest deficiencies. Spain did not simply replace the Andean order with an entirely foreign machine. It seized mechanisms the Inca state had already refined. The old empire had mobilized labor through the MITA, governed through Caracas, counted obligations through Quipu, stored goods in state warehouses, moved populations, and made reciprocity a language of power. Spanish authorities and settlers took these structures and bent them toward colonial profit. Tribute flowed to new masters. Labor obligations were pushed into harsher contexts. Local rulers remained indispensable, but their world had changed. They now had to answer Spanish demands above while preserving legitimacy among their own communities below. These indigenous intermediaries cannot be reduced to a single moral category. Some pursued advantage. Some sought protection for their people. Some maneuvered for survival inside impossible constraints. Caracas, translators, native nobles, labor organizers, informants, and rival factions inherited from the conquest all became essential to colonial power. Domination becomes cheaper when it can speak through local authority. But the deepest wound was demographic. Across the 16th century AD, Andean populations suffered catastrophic decline from repeated epidemics, violence, displacement, hunger, overwork, and social rupture. Exact numbers remain debated, and the scale varied by region, but the direction is unmistakable. Communities lost elders who carried memory, farmers who sustained terraces, ritual specialists who guarded sacred calendars, and children who embodied continuity. Disease was not merely death. It was the breaking of households, labor rhythms, kinship obligations, and confidence in the old protections of the cosmos. Then came silver. After the discovery of the great deposits at Potosi in AD 1545, after the initial fall of the Inca state, the Andes were bound to a planetary circuit of wealth. The colonial adaptation of the MITA, especially under later reforms, forced Andean labor into mines and refineries that fed imperial finance. Silver moved from Potosi toward Lima and Panama, across the Atlantic to Seville, into the counting houses of Antwerp, and eventually through Pacific routes toward Manila and Asia. A mountain in the high Andes helped animate a world economy. Andean suffering became entangled with European wars, royal debts, merchant credit, and the global hunger for bullion. Yet colonial transformation was never economics alone. It was also a war over meaning. Temples were seized or destroyed. Sacred huacas were attacked as idols. Churches rose over older places of power. Christianization advanced through preaching, coercion, schooling, confession, and spectacle. But Andean religion did not simply vanish. It adapted, concealed itself, blended, and resurfaced. Saints could occupy spaces once held by older sacred forces. Catholic ritual could be interpreted through Andean categories of reciprocity, presence, and obligation. Memory survived in festivals, landscapes, lineages, and quiet duties to places that conquest could rename but not fully erase. The new Andean order was therefore not a clean replacement. It was a layered regime of Spanish law, indigenous survival, forced labor, noble negotiation, Christian authority, Andean memory, and imperial extraction. Cajamarca had captured an emperor. Colonial rule attempted something even more ambitious: the capture of time itself, work time, ritual time, ancestral time, and the future owed by one generation to the next. And at this point, chronology begins to become diagnosis. Beneath the encomienda, the colonial MITA, Potosi, and the campaigns against huacas stands the deeper question: what kind of system collapses so thoroughly that its own machinery can be turned against the people who built it? By the time silver, tribute, mission churches, colonial courts, and forced labor regimes began remaking the Andes, Cajamarca could appear, from a distance, like the beginning of an inevitable Spanish age. But that is the danger of hindsight. Hindsight turns convergence into destiny. It takes contingency, fear, improvisation, and accident, then polishes them into a straight road. The fall of Tawantinsuyu was not inevitable. It was a chain reaction. Smallpox likely reached the Andes before Pizarro reached the imperial core, and around AD 1527 it likely killed Huayna Capac, perhaps taking the designated heir, Ninanquiyuchi, as well. That was not merely a biological disaster. It was a constitutional detonation. In a sacred monarchy, the ruler's body is political evidence. Evidence that the cosmos still protects the order, that the ancestors still favor the dynasty, that commands still descend from a legitimate center. When that body disappears suddenly, power does not simply transfer. It begins to tremble. Then came the civil war between Huascar and Atahualpa. The imperial elite did what ruling classes often do when succession becomes ambiguous. It mistook victory inside the palace for security across the empire. Atahualpa emerged triumphant, but triumph had cut the ruling class into factions, exhausted armies, terrorized lineages, and left the heart of the state filled with suspicion. Civil war is never only internal bloodshed. It is an advertisement to every outsider that the seams of power have opened. Pizarro saw those seams with predatory clarity. He did not possess the numbers to conquer the Andes by conventional war. At Cajamarca in AD 1532, he pursued something more surgical: hostage politics. Cajamarca was not merely a plaza, not merely an ambush, not merely an episode of shock violence. It was a system breach. An imperial operating system discovered, in one afternoon, that its central command could be physically seized by men who did not recognize its sacred rules. This is the first lesson. Centralization creates speed, but it also creates single points of failure. Tawantinsuyu could move labor, food, messages, armies, and ritual authority across staggering geography. Yet, when the person of the ruler became the command system, the capture of the ruler became a weapon against the state. The second lesson is colder. Outsiders rarely manufacture collapse from nothing. They enter ongoing arguments. They exploit rival heirs, local grievances, interpreters, religious theater, legal formulas, fear, and ambition already present inside the system. Spanish violence and ambition were real. Inca imperial coercion was real. Indigenous agency was real. Structural contingency was real. The conquest cannot be flattened into a fable of European genius or indigenous helplessness. It was a collision of actors, incentives, terrors, and misread worlds. The third lesson: epidemics are political events. Disease changes demography, but also morale, succession, labor, priestly authority, and the perceived favor of the cosmos. A pathogen does not need to understand a throne. It only needs to remove the body around which power has been arranged. And the fourth lesson may be the most haunting. Intelligence failure is often a failure of categories. Atahualpa's court could observe horses, steel, firearms, Christian ritual, interpreters, and Spanish aggression. But observation is not comprehension. The Inca world had no established model for a small foreign warband using legal theater, shock violence, and captive sovereignty to hijack an empire. Atahualpa did not lack power. He lacked a category for the kind of power standing before him. That is why Cajamarca still matters. Not because modern societies are Tawantinsuyu, and not because history repeats in costume. It matters because complex systems remain vulnerable when authority is over-centralized, succession is unclear, institutions depend on obedience more than legitimacy, and leaders classify anomalies as manageable disturbances until those disturbances reach the command center. The Inca state was not weak because it was disorganized. It was vulnerable because it was magnificently organized around a center that could be seized. The empire did not hand itself to the conquistadors because it lacked power. It did so because power had become too concentrated to survive capture. And so the final accounting comes into view. Not a simple story of a few Spaniards defeating millions, but a darker study of how empires break when disease, ambition, civil war, intelligence failure, and hostage politics arrive in the same historical hour. And so the old explanation collapses under its own simplicity. Tawantinsuyu did not fall because it was primitive. It did not fall because fewer than 200 Spaniards carried some mystical inevitability of conquest into the Andes. It fell because several fractures aligned at once, like hidden stress lines inside a mountain just before the avalanche. Smallpox likely reached the Andes before Pizarro reached the imperial heartland. It struck not only bodies but institutions. Around AD 1527, Huayna Capac died, and perhaps the chosen heir, Huayna Capac, died as well. In a sacred monarchy, that was not merely a family tragedy. It was a constitutional wound. The throne opened at the precise moment when the empire most needed continuity. Then succession became civil war. Huascar and Atahualpa were not simply rival brothers in a palace drama. Their struggle tore through the imperial elite, poisoned legitimacy in Cuzco, hardened the northern armies, shattered trust among royal lineages, and left the empire with a victorious faction standing over a wounded political order. Atahualpa won the war for command, but victory had narrowed his world. It had made him powerful, and it had made him exposed. Then came Pizarro. At Cajamarca in AD 1532, his force was too small to conquer the Andes by ordinary military arithmetic. But conquest is not always arithmetic. Sometimes it is diagnosis. Pizarro identified the single point of failure. He did not need to defeat the empire first. He needed to seize the man through whom the empire was trained to obey. Cajamarca was the breach. Atahualpa's captivity revealed the paradox at the heart of the Inca system. Even in chains, the emperor could still command the machinery of extraction. Gold and silver flowed into the ransom room because authority still flowed outward from his person. That ransom was not merely treasure. It was proof that the imperial operating system still functioned after its center had been hijacked. But the same obedience that displayed Inca administrative brilliance also exposed its vulnerability. When Atahualpa was executed in AD 1533, and when Cuzco was occupied that same year, the Spaniards did not inherit an empty world. They entered a shattered command structure and began learning how to operate it. Still, the Inca world did not simply vanish. Manco Inca's Great Revolt in AD 1536 proved that Cajamarca was decisive, but not final. The royal alternative endured in Vilcabamba for decades, until the execution of Tupac Amaru in AD 1572 marked the symbolic end of independent Inca kingship. After that came the deeper transformation. Encomienda, coerced labor, Christianization, epidemics, mining, new hierarchies, and the binding of Andean life to a wider imperial economy. The true cost, then, was not only the fall of a dynasty. It was the remaking of time, labor, memory, and legitimacy across an entire civilization. And this is why the story remains so unsettling. Human systems often confuse obedience with resilience. Victorious leaders mistake recent triumph for permanent security. Elites turn succession into civil war. Outsiders prosper when insiders are divided. Institutions built around one sacred or commanding center can move with astonishing speed, until the day that center is captured, discredited, or removed. The final question is not whether the Inca could have won at Cajamarca. The deeper question is whether any society can concentrate power so completely and still survive the moment when that power falls into hostile hands. The grand chessboard did not end at Cajamarca. It merely changed masters. For the next strategic history, the end screen now offers another case where power believed itself secure before history exposed the fracture beneath it. Continue there to keep the larger pattern in view. Subscribe to Archives of Humanity for disciplined, source-grounded studies of empire, collapse, ambition, and the machinery of power. And in the comments, answer one question. Which fracture mattered most in the fall of the Inca Empire? Disease, civil war, or the capture of Atahualpa?